So this is a joint work with Greg Lewis and Shoshana Vasserman, both of whom are here and available to answer any of your questions on Q&A or the chat. And we're very excited to share this work with you. So the paper is on voluntary disclosure and personalized pricing, and it sits in a literature that thinks about privacy and price discrimination. Now, of course, this literature has received a lot of interest in recent years, both from economics and computer science, in thinking about how firms might exploit their knowledge of consumer preferences, what market outcomes we may achieve by segmenting consumers in different ways, and broadly trying to understand whether personalized pricing is good or bad for consumer welfare. So to give you a snapshot of what we're doing, we'll be thinking about a model of personalized pricing where consumers can verifiably disclose evidence or hard information about their preferences in both monopolistic and competitive markets. So why are we doing this? So part of the reason we're doing this is because the way in which the three of us see this is that we're living in an evolving marketplace where policymakers are still trying to figure out what kinds of rules and regulations to set. And if one looks both in the popular press as well as in academic discourse, you see a huge emphasis on consumer control over their data. Now, it's not exactly clear what consumer control means. And so this provides an important opening for doing some game theoretic science fiction to understand how to organize this digital marketplace, see the effect of different regulations, so on and so forth. And that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to use a stylized model to understand some of the basic strategic forces that would exist in this marketplace when consumers have control over what information to disclose. So to sort of summarize, the question of this paper is simple. When consumers can choose what to verifiably disclose to the market, do they benefit from personalized pricing? And one of the reasons why we embarked on this project is that there's a classic strategic or game theoretic intuition that comes from the late 70s, early 80s from models of verifiable disclosure, where firms can draw inferences based on both what is disclosed and what isn't disclosed. And the classical literature highlighted how when I give someone the ability to disclose information, and firms are going to be able to draw inferences when this person does not disclose information, the person with the private information is going to lose all of their information rights. This is what the literature calls unraveling. And Greg, Shosh, and I thought that this would be an intuition that would emerge in our setting, and instead we find more interesting things happen in both monopolistic and competitive markets. So the goal for the rest of the talk is, I'm not going to go through the general model, but usually is to use some examples to illustrate the subtleties that emerge, okay? So that's where we're going. So in terms of outline, I'm going to first start off with the monopolist setting, show you what happens in these examples, and then we'll move on to competition. So here's a problem I want you to think about. There's a single consumer, and she has the unit demand for a good. She's got her value for that good is V, which is going to be drawn uniformly from 0 to 1. She's going to interact with a monopolist who incurs no cost of production. And she's going to observe her value for the good, the firm does not. So we all know how to solve this classical pricing problem. This is like Econ 101. The monopolist is going to set a price knowing that the consumer is going to buy at that price only if her valuation exceeds the price. And so they're thinking about, okay, trying to optimize the product of price and quantity, that leads you to an optimal price in this example of a half. And so in particular, what happens in the classical benchmark, which is what we're going to compare our results to, is that if my value is above a half, then I'm going to be able to skim some surplus there. If my value is below a half, I'm not going to be able to buy, and I just get a utility of 0, okay? And so this right here is the utility that I get when my value is V, and we're living in a world in which I can't say anything, disclose any information about my type. We're going to compare that classical world with the world in which we're interested in, where there's some opportunity for the consumer to communicate about her valuation to the firm. Here's how we model that communication. So the consumer, as before, is going to observe her valuation. After observing her valuation, she's going to be able to send a message that comes from the set M of V, which denotes the set of messages that are available to her. The monopolist observes the message and sets a price that's contingent on the message. The consumer then chooses whether to buy the product. And we're not going to be solving a mechanism design problem here. We're going to assume that neither party can commit, and we're just going to study perfect Bayesian equilibria of this game. Okay? An important part of what we're going to do is going to be thinking about properties of this message set that are either necessary or sufficient to help the consumer improve her welfare. So the two different kinds of technologies we're going to look at, the first is what we call simple evidence, where if my valuation is V, I can only say one of two things. Either I can reveal my valuation perfectly, this is this message right here, or I can say nothing at all, 0, 1. So in particular, if my value is 0.6, I am the only type who can say 0.6. That is my valuation. So this is a fully revealing, verifiable message. Or I can send a message, 0, 1, that every type can send. It's totally non-discriminatory. So this is meant to be a simple model to capture this dichotomy between track or do not track, where we're taking this to an extreme position where if the firm can track me, they sort of know my valuation perfectly. If they can't track me, they don't know anything about me, other than the fact that I chose to not be tracked. Okay. We're going to contrast that with a model of rich evidence, which allows for some partial disclosure. Now, if my type, my valuation for the good is V, I can send any closed interval that contains my true type. So if it's 0.6, I can say my valuation lies somewhere from 0.4 to 0.8. I cannot say that it lies somewhere from 0.1 to 0.3, okay? And so this allows me to reveal some information without having to give it all away. So if you want to sort of think about this quite simply, simple evidence corresponds to speaking the whole truth and nothing but the truth, or saying nothing at all. And rich evidence corresponds to saying nothing but the truth, okay? Cool. So what we're going to do in this paper is going to, if you want to imagine like a 2x2 table, we're going to think about simple and rich evidence on one, on the sort of the rows, and on the columns, we're going to be thinking about a monopolist case, which is where we are right now, and a competitive market. And we're going to think about the interaction between the technology of disclosure and the competitiveness. So I'm going to give some preliminary sort of like, or let's throw some darts on a dartboard here and see how this model works. So a preliminary observation is there exists a fully separating equilibrium where every type reveals itself. This is what the prior literature would think of as being unraveling. And the idea is pretty simple. Just think about a strategy profile where every type reveals itself. The monopolist is the one who sets the price, so it's going to set a price that extracts all surplus. And now if the consumer deviates, we're going to be able to argue that the payoff is still 0. And the reason the payoff is still going to be 0 is the firm is going to believe that whenever the consumer deviates and sends me some bigger message, the message must have come from the type, the highest type that can send that message. So if my valuation is 0.6 and I conceal some information and say it's somewhere from, let's say, 0.2 to 0.8, the monopolist is going to believe, oh, that must be type 0.8. I'm going to set a price of 0.8. Of course, as a value, if my value is 0.6, I'm not going to set buy at a price of 0.8. My payoff is still going to be 0. So neither the consumer nor the firm has the incentive to deviate. There also exists a fully pooling equilibrium where no type reveals itself. And in this equilibrium, every type just sends a message 0, 1. After that, the monopolist charges the optimal price of a half. And for any other message, the monopolist believes, once again, that the message is sent by the highest type that could have sent it. Now, once again, no one has an incentive to break from the pool, because if I break from the pool and I reveal who I am, the monopolist is going to be able to extract my surplus or ensure that I don't have a strictly profitable deviation. All right. So this sort of gives you sort of two preliminary observations. Now let me get into our main results. Can one actually do better with simple evidence than the classical benchmark model of no disclosure? And the answer is no. With simple evidence, for every equilibrium and for every consumer valuation, the interim consumer surplus that you're going to get is no more than what you would have gotten if you couldn't say anything at all about your type. So this is the payoff from no personalized pricing. So in particular, this is highlighting that focusing in a monopolistic model on the simple dichotomy between track and do not track is not going to be able to improve consumer surplus with personalized pricing beyond what consumers would be able to achieve if we had no disclosure and no personalized pricing. Okay, and this is a very general idea. Sort of, I've shown it to you right now in a sort of a small rinky-dinky example, but it holds across distributions and for general type spaces. Cool. For rich evidence, you can do better in some equilibria. And in particular, we're going to identify a greedy algorithm that's always going to be an interim Pareto improvement. It's going to guarantee trade occurring. No consumer is going to be worse off. And almost all consumers in 0 to 1/2 are strictly better off. And this construction uses Zeno's paradox. So it uses a construction similar to the partition that we have when we think about Zeno's paradox, about going from one end to another in half the many steps. So here's how the construction works. I'll just sort of give you the highlights of the construction. All types whose values from 1/2 to 1, they're going to send a message that says our values from 1/2 to 1. What the monopolist is going to do is going to price at 1/2 at the bottom of that interval. All types from 1/4 to 1/2 are going to say we're in 1/4 to 1/2. The monopolist is going to price at 1/4. And this is going to continue inductively. All types from 1/8 to 1/4 are going to say this is where we lie. Monopolist is always going to price at the bottom. So now, as you notice here, every consumer is, these consumers are getting the same price as they would without personalized pricing. But now these consumers are able to trade. And verifiable disclosure is helping them sort of separate out from the others and nevertheless be able to trade and get some strictly positive payoffs because the monopolist almost surely is pricing below their valuation. Okay, so this scheme generates an equilibrium. Let me not go through the argument, but in particular, I want to highlight why it is that the classical intuition of unraveling doesn't apply. So typically, unraveling emerges in settings in which my payoff as a sender is strictly monotone in the belief I can induce in a receiver. That property breaks in this setting. Here, the monopolist charges the same price when she knows that my valuation is 1/2 with probability 1, as when she believes that my valuation is uniform between 1/2 to 1, even though one of those beliefs first order stochastically dominates the other. And what this means is that you can pool types with type 1/2 without giving that type an incentive to separate. Okay, so the summary from the monopolist model is that simple evidence does not help consumers at all. Rich evidence is needed, meaning we need to give the consumer an opportunity to be able to partially disclose information about her type without revealing it all. We're going to see that when it comes to competition, that even simple evidence is going to help. And let me sort of lead you with the key intuition. The key intuition is going to be that disclosure and information is going to amplify competition between the firms, leading to better prices. So here's the example in which we encapsulate this idea. Imagine that there are two firms located at -1 and 1. This is going to be Hotelling or Bertrand with differentiated products. And as a consumer, I'm located somewhere on this line between the two. So this is my type, L, and that's going to determine my transportation cost. If I buy from firm R, I pay a transportation cost of 1 minus L. If I buy from firm L, I pay a transportation cost that once again is linear in the distance. And my overall payoff from buying from either of these firms is I get some term V, which is common knowledge, minus the price I pay, minus the transportation cost, okay? And for the purposes of what I'm going to say here, let's assume that this V is sufficiently high so that the consumer is always going to buy from one of these two firms. All right, so without disclosure, this is once again an Econ 101 problem without disclosure. The classical problem would have both firms setting a price of 2, and I just buy from whichever firm I'm closer to, okay? So that's the classical non-disclosure benchmark. What happens with, okay. Let me see, why is my slide not advancing? My slides are not advancing. Okay, let me. Sorry, Richard, I can't hear you. I hear you. I see you saying something. Okay. So what the key question is what happens without with hard evidence, with disclosure here. Now what's going to happen is that now what's going to happen is each consumer is, well, let me first start off with simple evidence. So hopefully each of you can still imagine a line. I'm drawing it in thin air. You know, I've got firm L here, firm R here. I'm located somewhere on this line. And now what each consumer is going to be able to do with simple evidence is they tell the firm that's the more distant firm exactly where they're located. And they keep quiet relative to the firm that they're closer to. The firm that's more distant is going to try to poach me as a consumer, and it's going to set a very low price. It's going to set a price of 0 in order to poach me. The firm that's closer to me, when it doesn't receive any disclosure about my location, it's going to just know that I'm sufficiently close, but doesn't know how close, but it knows that I'm receiving a very attractive price from its competitor. And because it knows that I'm receiving a very attractive price from the competitor, it's going to also reduce its prices. So this is sort of an intuition with simple evidence that one of the problems that we had without disclosures, both firms were charging a price of 2. Each firm knows that the competitor is charging a high price. Whereas with some disclosure, I'm able to get the firms that sort of know it's hard to get my business to really reduce their prices in order to try to attract me, which once again makes my home firm, the firm I'm more likely to purchase from, also reduce their price. Okay, so now this construction would, that's just a construction with simple evidence. With rich evidence, you can sort of take the Xenos partition that we had constructed somewhat on steroids. You can sort of have it go from both ends, becoming Xenos partition until you get right down to the middle. And so we actually began with the competitive framework and found this result there, and then thought, okay, this must be known for the monopolist. And so then we backtracked when we discovered that the corresponding results hadn't been found for the monopolist. Okay, so let me wrap up. So what this talk has been about trying to understand the role of verifiable disclosure in personalized pricing. One of the things that we often think of as the benefits of communication is to allow for product customization. And what our results are highlighting is that even absent gains of product customization, personalized pricing can help reduce prices and improve consumer surplus. That's all I have. Sorry about the technical snafu.